Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much for this kind and gracious invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and also to get to know you and your institute and the works that you have been doing lately. So thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure. Now, about al-Ghazali's thought on rationalism, but also his understanding of epistemology. So the knowledge, but also the sources of knowledge. For someone like Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who, as you might know, is a towering figure who really delftly navigated various fields from law to theology to philosophy to Sufism, I think we have to perceive him or read his text and his work through the lens of heterogeneity, meaning that he navigated various epistemological fields, right? Sometimes we perceive them as separate, but al-Ghazali shows that they're really intertwined, right? That there is no law without Sufism, and there is no philosophy without theology, and so on and so forth, right? And I think this comes forth, especially in his Ihya al-Ulum, the revival of religious sciences. Now, for al-Ghazali, the very idea, the very notion of knowledge is something that it's transformative, meaning knowledge is not only something to be obtained, that too, but not for the sake of being obtained alone, right? So yes, on one hand, there is this idea of utility of knowledge. You need knowledge to utilize, to explain the world, the natural phenomena around you. But on the other hand, al-Ghazali actually asserts that knowledge is much more important. It transforms human beings, right? It makes them better, if you will. So that's first sort of note. What does that mean more in practice? One, that the very notion of ʿilm, if we translate it as knowledge or science, sometimes in English as well, is very much connected to amal, right? So ʿilm presupposes informed practice, right? Knowledge without its usage is futile. In other words, if you do not put knowledge into practice, it doesn't serve any meaning, right? So the interplay, the connection, or the interlink between ilm and amal is of key importance in his thought. And this, I think, really comes to the forefront in Ihya al-Ulum, and I will refer to that probably multiple times through our discussion, because I see Ihya as a work where al-Ghazali really puts forth a whole epistemological system. It's an ethical epistemological system of how to conduct oneself, right? It's about matters of conduct, how to eat, how to sleep, how do you interpret dreams, how do you earn money, right? So it's very practical, very material, but also very spiritual, non-material things. How to better oneself. And what is the end goal? Well, it's the cleansing of the heart, right? Taharatul qulub. And eventually that leads into salvation. So the end goal is obviously to obtain salvation. If we go back to the very idea of knowledge or the purpose, the aim of knowledge, there are three stages of knowledge. As per al-Ghazali, one is sensory knowledge, knowledge based on our senses, what we see, what we hear, what we smell. Exactly. Second is rational knowledge, knowledge that is obtained based on our reasoning, rational faculty. And third and final is intuitive knowledge. Right? Intuitive knowledge is the highest form of knowledge, and that obviously pertains to various Sufi stations of muraqaba, muhasaba, introspection, dhawq, which doesn't mean really physical tasting, but tasting of the divine, right? And so on and so forth. So three levels of knowledge. But then al-Ghazali also divides knowledge into two types. Ilm al-mu'amala, so the knowledge of the transaction, how to conduct oneself. This obviously pertains to anything that has to do with, let's call it material world, right? How to engage in, and we can come back obviously to the economic thought as well. I think this is very important. How to engage with trading, how to engage with selling, buying. So your own self-conduct. On the other hand is ilm al-mukashafa, so the knowledge of the unveiling, which is believed to be of Sufi origin, so related to tasawwuf, the science of tasawwuf. And again, the ʿilm al-mukashafa is here the pinnacle of obtaining that type of knowledge, right? So he really tries to present a unity between obtained sciences, rational sciences, and divine sciences. So on one hand, you have the religious sources, the Quran, the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad, alayhi salam, and on the other hand, other sciences that you obtain through rational mathematics, astronomy, astrology, and so on and so forth, right? Rational thinking as well. Now, how does this, to your second part of your question, how does this challenge the notion of, rationality, perhaps, or adds to it in our modern world? I mean, I think someone like al-Ghazali has to be read and reread over and over again. I think this pertains not only to his, economic thought or what I call environmental thought or ethics, and we can come to that maybe later on, but overall, such a towering figure like al-Ghazali, his work has to be read in tandem, right? If one reads al-Mustasfa, which is really his work on exactly on fiqh and usul al-fiqh primarily, it cannot be fully divorced from Tahafut al-Falasifa, and Tahafut al-Falasifa cannot be fully divorced from Ihya, and so on and so forth. Even though these are different genres, or Nasihat al-Muluk, right? The mirror, which is mirror for princes, is a different type of genre. It's advice for counsel. But I think we have to look at his work as his opus as a whole. What is he really putting forward, right? And to my knowledge, to my reading, he's putting forth an ethical system, which really comes to the forefront in Ihya. It's a whole ethical system of how to improve your qualities as a human being, right? And this is where the notion of knowledge, I think, is key. The first book of Ihya is book on knowledge, right? Kitab al-Ilm. And as you know, I mean, Ihya has 10 books. Each book is divided into 10 different chapters and so on and so forth, right? So he's trying to, as the title suggests, he's trying to, quote unquote, revive what he considered already in the 12th century or end of the 11th century, revive the lost sciences at the time, right? So he's saying we're unhappy with governmental officials. We're unhappy of how even in some part Muslims conduct themselves. Some of the sciences have been lost from the 7th, 8th century. What we have to put forth is to revive them. So it's a encyclopedic work of sorts. So therefore, I think reviving al-Ghazali in our time, as it goes for many other scholars in Islamic tradition, is important, right? To answer your question directly. And this pertains to the notion of rationality, but also when it comes to economic, ethical, environmental thought more specifically.
Okay. So the first part of the question regarding his epistemology, how does maybe it relates back to the rationalism? We know rationalism today, it's ontologically is divorced from the metaphysical world of the God and nature itself. But how does Ghazali see his ontological link between his epistemology, al-Kashaf, the Zouk, and its relation with economical thought?
Yeah, thank you for that. So the world as such, so meaning Dunya. Dunya is connected to Akhirah, in the sense that whatever, as per al-Ghazali, whatever you do in the Dunya eventually reflects your station, your position, your locale in the Akhirah as well. Meaning that it's not only a teleological understanding of the world, meaning that it's based on purpose. Indeed, al-Ghazali informs us in Hikmah fi Makhluqat Allah, right? His rather short book on the creation of the world and environment and nature and so forth. He informs us that the world is created for a purpose, so it's teleological, it's purpose-based or it's purpose-oriented. But again, if you read Hikmah in relation to Ihya or other works, it's not only a teleology that it's at stake or at play here, but that is very much connected to a whole ethical, framework, right? That he's putting forward. Meaning, the world serves a purpose to improve yourself. But not only that, right? It's not only teleological in this sense. It's not only purpose-based. There's an ethical epistemology sort of embedded in it. So you can, this means more specifically that you can utilize, for instance, nature or natural resources to your own benefit. You can utilize the notion of money, mal, money or wealth, to your own benefit. But again, that's one side of the picture. That's one side of the whole story, right? In addition to this utility, I think scholars such as al-Ghazali, but also an array of other classical scholars, they're trying to say that it's not just the utility of money that it's important, the usefulness of money, the usefulness of wealth, that too. But it's connected to your, what I would call the ethical self. How do you not only improve yourself, but maybe your family, your neighbors, your community? What kind of impact does it have, the fact that you have money or you possess wealth, right? So on one hand is utility, on the other hand is this moral intricacy, ethical self that it's put in place, right? So, for instance, one who is wealthy, for al-Ghazali means that, well, that person becomes a liability to society. You're more responsible. The more wealth you have, the more responsible you are towards your society, or the members of your society. Now we can again discuss what exactly society means. Is it, you know, the immediate person who lives next to you? You can imagine in 10th, 11th century, what is important is, or the impact that you might have is on the immediate people surrounding you, your family, your community, your milieu, right? So something like mal, wealth or money, it has its usefulness, but it also brings about the spiritual, moral, ethical sentiments of a human being. So that's why I see that the whole idea of his economic thought really might be interpreted as the backbone of his ethical system. How so? Well, again, if we go back to the interplay between ilm and amal, this is where it really comes, to the forefront. Obtaining knowledge about economic practices, financial transactions, informs one's religiosity, right? Confirms one's spiritual, ethical endeavors. And here I see that really the ilm and amal interplay, it's very much embedded in his economic thought, right? If you only obtain knowledge and you do not put knowledge into practice, it's without benefit, it's futile, right? And this really is apparent in his economic thought. And I can give you, more concrete examples maybe down the line as well on what he means by what is the notion of selling, what is the notion of buying, what is the notion of sort of engaging in financial transactions and so forth.
Yeah, sure. So my next question is regarding how does his overall view of his economical thoughts in relation to today critiques of capitalism and we call consumerism. It's an antithesis of it, the idea of consumerism, capitalism nowadays. How does al-Ghazali views?
So it's very difficult on one hand to interpret al-Ghazali's work or any other scholar's sort of work from what we would call the Middle Ages, which is again a very incorrect, historically incorrect, but also very Eurocentric understanding of world history. Right, Middle Ages was Middle Ages for a particular geographical locale, right, and not maybe necessarily for the Islamic world, but let's say the 11th, 12th century. Why? Because let's say the idea of ecological crisis did not exist, or capitalism as such, as a modern phenomenon, did not exist. The idea of modern nation state did not exist, right, to that our own understanding, as how we interpret it today. Nevertheless, if you were to pose, would al-Ghazali agree or disagree with neoliberal capitalism? I think the answer it's quite straightforward. I think he would very much disagree, right? Again, on the basis of this idea of the ethical self. If an ethical system is put forth, that it's based on moral intricacies, ethical understanding of financial engagement, then I think this is diametrically opposite to neoliberal capitalism, right? As you might know, sort of classical understanding of economic gains means it's a utility-based approach. So again, it's based on usefulness or purposefulness. It's about individual gain, not necessarily what is beneficial to the community at large or society at large. It's about individual rational choice theories, right? So all of these proposals would go against al-Ghazali's sort of ethical economic system, or what I would call ethical economic genre. And al-Ghazali really comes at the 12th century. It's somewhat late. You have an array of scholars before him that are also engaging in what I would call ethical economic treaties or texts or so forth, right? This is anyone from al-Shaybani already, right? 8th century, Ibn Abil Dunya, al-Isfahani, al-Muhasibi as well, al-Maqrizi later on, but al-Mawardi prior to al-Ghazali as well. And then after al-Ghazali, you have, I would say, a slightly different orientation with Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Khaldun, slightly different understanding, maybe a little bit more legalistic in some sense. But still, I mean, all in all, a lot of these scholars are engaging also with various quote-unquote Sufi ideas, conceptualizations of wealth and money and selling and buying. What you have today is an attempt to present a more human face of capitalism as well, right? You have something called business ethics, you have green ethics, or a green economy, excuse me. Other different sort of approaches, understanding how to make the economic system more humane, which I think means really embellishing a particular understanding of economic system or financial system, but really doesn't mean really uprooting it or transforming it or transcending it. So that is problematic from a standpoint of someone like al-Ghazali, right? What al-Ghazali is trying to say is it's about revamping not only the financial economic frameworks, but it's really about transforming yourself in the process, right? It's not only about addressing the intricacies of a financial system as such, that too, but in that process, while you engage in economic ideas or financial ideas, you're transforming yourself. It's about addressing your own ethics, your own shortcomings, your own approaches, moral approaches to the reality of things, right? And to just give you, for instance, a few examples, and this is more sort of technical in nature, but again, I think al-Ghazali's understanding on financial transactions, these legalistic technical aspects must be looked or go hand in hand with his overall epistemology, right? For instance, he says that about mal or money, that money was not created for its own sake, right? Money is not an end in and of itself. It's only a means to higher ends, means to higher goals, to achieve, again, divine spiritual goals. Doesn't mean that it has to be spent only on religious matters. Money can be spent on non-religious matters, right? Or it's a means of to facilitate a transaction. So you can buy something, you can sell something, or it has to be spent to achieve higher ends, right? So you cannot create money in order to make more money. That would be sort of illicit in the eyes of, or from al-Ghazali's perspective or viewpoint.
But that's the current financial system. Yeah, money creates money.
Well, it's exactly when you look into within the context of investments as well, right? Or it's about making profit. And again, making profit is not illegal in Islam. You know that from the religious sources, from the Quran, from certain hadith, from other scholars in intellectual history. As a matter of fact, making profit is encouraged, right? I mean, the Muslim society in the 7th century was very well versed in trading. The Prophet Muhammad himself was married to a wealthy merchant as well, right? So making profit is not illicit or illegal. It's on the opposite, it's encouraged. The question is, how do you engage in economic transactions and financial transactions? What do you do with that money? How do you sell? How do you buy? And this is where sort of, quote unquote, these legal regulations come in place. But again, I perceive all these legal regulations not on their own terms, but in relation to an ethical system, right? And that's why, you know, scholars in Islamic studies would say that, at least some of them, law and ethics, it's impossible to distinguish them per se, right? Moral law, I mean, Sharia as a moral law is very much embedded in an ethical system. Is not something that is perceived as, in modern legalistic terms, as a top-down, very hegemonic approach indeed, which is, I think, comes to the forefront in a modern period, early modern European period, and the modern nation state as well, right? So how to engage in selling, right? And al-Ghazali says, for instance, that you should not sell a commodity to an ill-minded person, so some person who has something bad in mind, right? If you can capture that moment at all. Someone who is a minor, someone who is blind, or someone who is not even righteous in character, right? And on the other hand, the seller himself or herself should not jack up commodities or prices of a commodity in a market. So you can sell it at a marketplace. And if a price of a commodity is too high, the buyer has the right to refuse it, right? So all of this means that there's an what we would call in English moral or ethical play, right? At hand. I mean, it's happening, sort of. It's occurring. It's not about the transaction as such. And you can go back and you can see that the very notion of market in the pre-modern period, the notion of souk, is not only a place when you buy and sell. It serves multiple purposes, right? It brings community together. Yes, it's about selling and buying. It's about commodities and goods. But it's also where you meet people. It's also where you engage in some type of relationship. So it's more than just the technical, legalistic aspect of financial transactions, right?
Okay, so
going back to that question, because you have elaborated such and such about al-Ghazali ideas, but in short ideas. But maybe we can turn up and make it more elaboration on how al-Ghazali views market, how does he views transaction, how does our current, nowadays we see that the relation in souk or the market is a transactional relationship. Yeah, we come and buy and we ended with that kind of relationship. There's no ethical or moral relationship nowadays in the souk. So how does al-Ghazali sees all this, his ethical views in relation with all this financial? How does he sees the economy and such?
Yeah, thank you for that. So it's, for instance, the notion of just price. Maybe you've heard of that as well. It's something that comes up not only in al-Ghazali's work, but also in other ethicists, what I would call them, or scholars from the classical period, but also in Western scholars in the medieval time, right? The notion of just price is very important. What exactly it means obviously differs from scholar to scholar and text to text somewhat, even though there is a common understanding that a fair price of a commodity or a just price of a commodity is the prevailing price at the market at the time, right? So whatever it's acceptable, agreeable upon, that is the just price of a commodity. Now, there is this idea that prices are determined not by humans, right, but from the sky, so to speak, from the divine, right? And that we're just regulating price. So the seller is just, the merchant is regulating the prices only. Some scholars might interpret that as in in a very quote-unquote capitalistic sense, in the sense that there is no upper limit, that anything goes, that you can increase the prices of a commodity even unfairly. For some scholars, even more specifically, they would interpret the early Islamic history as a history that it's prone to early form of capitalism. Exactly because sort of the Muslim community was informed with trade, was very well versed in trade, and they would say, well, a rudimental form of capitalism already started prior to modern capitalism in 8th century Arabia. I would say that this thesis is somewhat flawed because it does not take into account exactly the ethical regulations of Sharia's moral law. Right, and at the other end of the spectrum, you might have scholars such as Timur Quran, who says that Islamic tradition never developed a institution of corporation, right? Which is the case, but again, because of the rigidity of Islamic law, as per Quran, right? Which again is somewhat problematic thesis. I think the ethical patterns of Sharia's moral law are the reasons why this is not taking place or has not taken place, right? On the other hand, scholars such as Benedict Köhler would say, well, no, the rudimental form of capitalism already existed in some shape or form in the 7th, 8th century. So, looking into, again, al-Muhasibi, Ibn Abi Dunya, al-Isfahani, al-Ghazali, but also other scholars, Ibn Taymiyyah even, indicates that these scholars were very much cognizant of these ethical patterns of Sharia's moral law. They discussed it in various different ways, some in more legalistic, others in more theological, others in more sort of Sufi terms or conceptualizations. But this very much boils down to the very, as you pointed out, to the very notion of financial transactions. That again, the engagement, the financial economic engagements are never meant to be understood on their own terms, but in light of Sharia's moral law, right? An ethical system, sort of. Now, what does that mean more specifically? In addition to the notion of just price, for instance, hoarding, so keeping large amounts of food supplies, would be illicit. It's illegal. It's unlawful, right? Hoarding of medicine, it's illicit as well. Especially in times of crisis, right? When a society is facing sort of some type of crisis, it means the society is in need. The members of the society are in dire need of food supplies or medicine or other goods. So if a merchant or if a seller or if an authority, governmental authority, which is today equivalent to the state, would hoard food supplies while other members of society are suffering, that is unethical to say the least, right? And then per al-Ghazali, this is illicit. So we might think of the discrepancies that are, obviously this does not mean I do not want to romanticize the Islamic period. I mean there was obviously poverty in history. It's human. Any Islamic period is part of human history as such. So there was poverty. There were divisions between wealthy and rich, right? Absolutely. But looking at this text maybe provides us with twofold understanding. On one hand, they wanted to improve the living conditions, right? The condition of being a human. And two, the abundance of this text coming from 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century really points to the fact that they were dissatisfied, this is how I read them, with governmental authority and officials and also scholars. Right? Al-Ghazali points, and he says that the scholars of the time, they are ulama al-Dunya, right? They're part of this world. They forgot about the akhirah, right? So al-Ghazali is someone actually who, even though he was part of the establishment, he was employed at the prestigious Nizamiya Madrasa. Eventually, as you know, he left that position. He also critiques governmental officials. He critiques the ulama of the day, right? So hoarding food supplies, hoarding medicine is illegal or illicit. Forgetting about the just or abusing the notion of the just price is illicit. Selling to people who are not righteous is illicit, right? Or buying for those people is illicit. And then we can draw parallels what does that mean in our daily life or contemporary world as well? Is there any usefulness? Is there any utility of al-Ghazali, if you will, in today, right? In today's analogous discussion on one, capitalism and neoliberal capitalism, which, as we all know, it's based on rational choice theory, allegedly, individual utility, and so on and so forth. But also on the modern field of Islamic economics. And maybe, you know, we can get into that, because that's a large sort of topic to discuss. But maybe it suffices to say that on one hand, I affirm certain mechanisms and tools of modern Islamic economics and scholars who have been really pioneers since the second half of the 20th century. But I also see the shortcoming of the discipline and of the field. And in my mind, it has not really reached its aim, which was put forth in the 1970s and 80s and 90s.
You can elaborate on that.
To elaborate on that?
Yeah.
No, we're opening a can of worms. No, so if we think of modern Islamic economics as a modern field, right? It springs out in the second half of the 20th century.
Yeah.
I would say one, it's based on various ideas and scholars from the revivalist period, right? Somebody, even if you think of Abdu and Rashid Rida, al-Afghani to some extent, Sayyid Qutb, especially then Maududi, right, in India or Pakistan. So it's based on some of its ideas, because the revivalists, they never discussed directly Islamic economic thought, right? There is no such thing. But they were concerned with socioeconomic issues of within Muslim societies. And they addressed it within the context of colonialism, British colonialism in Egypt, and so on and so forth, right? So that's one thing. Second, it's really Abdul Islahi, for instance, Abdulaziz Islahi, he points out that it was the early scholars in South Asia that started discussing the notion of Islamic economic thought as in iqtisad al-Islami, which again is somewhat problematic when we can come back to this notion of iqtisad al-Islami, whether it exists or not, and what exactly does it mean. But he says it's the South Asian scholars or economists who started actually bringing that term up, which means that the term comes prior to Maududi, even though Maududi is usually credited for having started modern Islamic economic thought, right? But Maududi is very, very important in this debate. He's someone who popularized the term, someone who actually popularized the field. A lot of his writing was published not only in Urdu, but in English. His disciples further his work, right? Khurshid Ahmed and so on and so forth. They translate the works as well. They engage with certain publishing houses. So Maududi really popularized the field well beyond the borders of India, Pakistan. The idea of modern Islamic economics really started off as a third way economic system, something that challenges socialism on one hand, but also capitalism on the other hand, right? I think it's a noble idea. It says we want to go beyond the construction of socialism and capitalism based or rooted in Islamic moral understanding and Islamic tradition, based on the religious sources of the Quran and so on and so forth. But then, in my reading of this tradition, something is amiss, in the sense that, one, various modern Muslim economists, they tap into the existing field of economics, obviously, to further, quote-unquote, modern Islamic economics, meaning they're dealing with the terms and concepts that are already in existence, which is somewhat problematic, because you're not looking back, if you will, into your own tradition when it comes to concepts and in terms. Not in order to go back to the sort of Salaf al-Salih. It's not about that. It's not about going back, but it's trying to understand what exactly these concepts and terms means. And that's why I said that the notion of al-iqtisad al-Islami is somewhat problematic because it's a modern term.
Yeah.
It's a modern conceptualization. If you look in al-Ghazali, if you look in al-Isfahani, if you look at the other scholars, there is no such term as al-iqtisad al-Islami. You do not find it. Meaning it doesn't exist. You have other terms. Kasb, right? Kasb as in acquisition of wealth, livelihood, ma'ash, qasd as well, and so on and so forth, right? Mal, absolutely. But you have other terms, other concepts. You do not have this modern understanding of iqtisad as economics only. Because kasb is not only economics. Right? It goes beyond that. It's a different conceptualization. So in this sense, it's very problematic. Second, so they tap into the existing field of economics. And second, they do not look back into the Islamic intellectual tradition. So a lot of modern scholars, they look into sort of how to move forward. How do we go out of this conundrum of neoliberal capitalism and socialism, right, in the 70s and 80s? But then what we ended up doing is Islamic finance, which is also very important, and I'm not versed in Islamic finance. And then the most lucrative subfield is Islamic banking, right? And Islamic banking really comes to the forefront. So now when people say Islamic economics, they really think of Islamic banking. Islamic banking is a niche. It's very important, very lucrative, very profitable as well. But it's a niche within this, spectrum. When we say Islamic economic thought, or when I say Islamic economic thought, I mean the theoretical, also classical, but also modern contributions that possibly challenge our understanding of what economy and economics is, right? And then the third point, if I may add, we can ask ourselves, is there such a thing as an Islamic economy, right, in the modern Muslim majority countries? And there is no such thing as Muslim or Islamic economy, right? There is Islamic economics as a field of study, Islamic finance, Islamic banking as a niche that to some extent, yes, it introduces a lot of important mechanisms from riba, right, the prohibition of usury, to zakat, to any other mechanisms and tools, but it also operates as a niche within the global system. And this is both, I think, inevitable, but also problematic, right?
It's kind of like you're trying to Islamicize the current global system, capitalism, Islamic capitalism.
You can say one argument would be, yes, that you're trying to Islamicize the economics or financial system by introducing these very important otherwise tools and mechanisms. But then if an Islamic economy really exists, it would have to operate outside of the global financial market, which is almost impossible as well, right? So in that sense, I see very noble and important endeavors by the pioneers that put forth in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. That was then, and again, the works that Islamic banking system is doing is probably incredibly important. But they still operate within the global system. And second, the next important question is, what's the aim of Islamic economic thought or system? If its aim is to eradicate poverty, then they failed, right? Yeah. If the aim is to cater to the wealthier, then I guess they're succeeding in some sense better, right? So yeah.
So how do we build on top of the pioneer works? When you say we know that the pioneers of the 70s, the 80s, even in Malaysia, we know that one of the top Islamic banking's work is acceptable worldwide. That Malaysia is one of the top. Yes. But as you said, when we say about the Islamic economical thoughts, we think of operating within the same market, the same that you said, current global market. We cannot remove. We cannot separate ourselves from the current market.
Yeah.
So how do you think that if you want to build the 1980s pioneering works of so-called Islamic economics, how do you see not just the way forward, but what does we need? How does al-Ghazali thoughts can come about in these current works?
Yeah, this is, I mean, it's an important but also very difficult question, because my answer would be twofold. One is looking, for instance, specifically at scholars such as al-Ghazali, and what can we benefit from reading him today, in 2025, for instance, right? In the context of, let's say, economic or financial system. And the other answer would be maybe more related to the idea of you have to get away with system as economic system as such, and I will come to that in relation to the notion of decolonization as well. So first, what is the value or the benefit of al-Ghazali? I would say we're still reading, at least in some capacity and in some context, scholars such as Aristotle and Plato, right? Even though they're thousands of years old. Meaning there is always value in philosophy, and moral philosophy specifically, right? We should similarly treat our own tradition, Islamic tradition. And you might say, well, but this is really, and I'm getting this question sort of often. This is museum studies, in the sense that who is going to read a 12th century scholar? What's the value of 12th century scholar for today? And I would say, well, you can start with the translation. If there is a good translation in English or other languages as well, there is value in that, right? It's about not only the ethical system that he's putting forward, but overall benefit of how al-Ghazali links various sciences and fields of study. That again, ethics is not completely disassociated from economics, and economics is not fully disassociated from environment, and environment is actually part of the divine world, right, or the divine creation. So it gives us a sense of unity within different fields, but also sense of how things are interrelated and interconnected in our globalized world, right? I mean, if you really want to seriously study economics, you cannot bypass environment and nature. Economy is part of nature. We're even talking about natural resources, right? And again, as per generally Islamic tradition, natural resources are extremely important. You cannot privatize water. You cannot privatize water sources. You cannot privatize fire. You cannot privatize natural resources. Right? It goes against the grain of the ethical understanding of earth, right? And again, in modern capitalism, you can very much privatize water. You privatize electricity. You privatize all sorts of things.
In the name of profit.
In the name of profit, even though on the surface, in the name of humanity, but it's not in the name of humanity. It's the name of making profit, right? So profit before people. That's I think the motto of capitalism. It's profit before people, right? So what is the value of al-Ghazali is exactly that, right? He brings to the surface very important understanding of how we treat different disciplines and fields as interconnected. And I think this is true for other classical scholars as well. Second, we might incorporate al-Ghazali's text into our curricula. And I know that a lot of projects on al-Ghazali exist, both in the States, in North America, in neighboring Indonesia, right? You have the al-Ghazali project. It was part of the tazkiyah college as well. You have translation works being done with Fons Vitae, right? And it's not only al-Ghazali, again, not to romanticize al-Ghazali. There is a lot of critique on al-Ghazali and his understanding of, gender roles and different aspects within economy and financial world as well. But this goes for other scholars within the tradition as well. Second, how to move forward, because we're standing on the shoulders of, right, or we're at the feet of the giant, so to speak, right? If we're serious about the economic project, the Islamic economic project, I think it will have to be theorized and conceptualized within the framework of decolonization. And obviously there is a difference between decolonization and decoloniality, right? Decolonization usually refers to something that it's more socio-legal or legal political, as a formal decolonization from a colonial force, right? And decoloniality has to do with the remnants of colonization that seep into various domains, from education to philosophy to law and economics and so forth. So decolonization as in to uncolonize something that has been colonized. And we know that Muslim world, as well as other parts of the world, have been colonized, right? You guys have experienced various types of colonization as well, which means not only to attain legal forms of decolonization when you claim independence from a political authority, but decoloniality is a process of going back into your own tradition, looking into certain concepts, terms, ideas, conceptualizations, and seeing what do they mean within a specific era or specific context, right? And again, if we look at our case in economics, what is really kasb? And how many scholars, they talk about kasb in relation to zuhd. Al-Shaybani, Al-Muhasibi, al-Ghazali as well. Right, kasb on one hand, so acquisition of wealth. On the other hand, zuhd, renouncing the world. Right? How does this differ from modern understanding of iqtisad or economics? And you can have this process, you can apply this process to different fields, philosophy as well, education, and so on and so forth. Right? What exactly is tarbiyah, for instance? How does it relate? How is it similar or different from different traditions? Right? So if we're serious about Islamic economic project, I think it has to be theorized in relation to decolonization. And that also means that, and this is in a pure sort of social science perspective as well, no proper revolution in economic terms can happen without changing not only of the political system, but of the economic system. So once you're still have the same system, economic system at place, regardless of the political establishment or legal establishment, there's no such thing as a proper change, right? So proper change has to happen in economic terms. And indeed, Malaysia is one of the few countries in the world, if not the only country in the world, where it has achieved the so-called the third stage of Islamic finance. So it's the most advanced. But as you know, it's also, it's very much connected to the global world and the global financial markets as well, right?